So given the occasion, I also thought it was going to be more appropriate, instead of having some work very specific in detail on a very specific topic. I thought it was more appropriate to present some more general big picture talk that kind of takes off from the very specific works that I've been working on in the last years on paradoxes and substructural logics. But I try to, in this particular paper, I try to take, as it were, a step back and see more and have a look more at the bigger picture that I think emerges from this more specific work I've been doing. So in particular, what I'd like to discuss with you today is the kind of philosophical interpretation of substructural approaches to paradox. And these are approaches to certain paradoxes that we're going to briefly mention. They use substantially a substructural logics. And I'm going to explain what a substructural logics is. For the time being, simply the idea is logics that, instead of immediately revising the behavior of specific logical operations like negation, conjunction, the conditional, and so on, revise instead the behavior of most structural elements of logical consequence, like premise combination, conclusion combination, entailment, and similar elements. So I'm interested in this issue because there's a kind of, I'm going to present it more in detail later, but there's a kind of, I think, common view about what the structural level of the structural elements is and how it relates to the level of logical operation. There's basically the view that the structural level is more fundamental and determines, at least partly, the operational level. And that view is in turn used to interpret substructural logics as logics that are very different from structural non-classical logics, and substructural approaches to paradoxes approaches are very different from other non-classical approaches. And what I really like to do in this talk is to argue against this view and actually propose an opposite view, on which the operational level is more fundamental than the structural level and partly determines the structural level, and briefly elaborate on what this means for the interpretation of substructural logics in themselves and for the interpretation of substructural approaches to paradox. So that's the main theme of the talk. So more in detail, I'm going to structure my discussion in 4 parts. The first one, super brief. I'll briefly mention what are the paradoxes of interest for this talk. In the second section, I'm going to briefly introduce the kind of substructural logics we're interested in, and also present very briefly what a substructural approach to a paradox is and why substructural approaches to paradox are interesting and at least to some extent successful. Then the main, really the main positive sections of the talk are going to be the third and the fourth one. In the first section, I'm going to present my arguments for the claim that the level of logical operations is prior to the level of structure of logical consequence. And in the first section, I'm going to draw the consequences for what this claim means, both for philosophical interpretation of substructural logics and for a philosophical interpretation of substructural approaches to paradox. So that's the plan of the talk. Can you see when I'm moving the slides? Like this? Yes, okay. Okay, so First of all, just to mention the paradoxes they were interested in. There are lots of philosophical paradoxes. I don't need to go into any detail given the audience. So I really like to save time on this and just mention that basically the target paradoxes in this discussion are basically of three kinds. First, we have the semantic paradoxes. So like, for example, the liar paradox. Here on the slides, you have a presentation which we can skip. Then we have the paradoxes of vagueness, the second kind of paradox, particularly the Sorites paradox. Again, there's no need, given the audience, to explain what the Sorites paradox is. And I also like to mention in this area, it's also important to keep in mind a third kind of paradox, which is basically the paradoxes of the material conditional. Now, in the slides I use, be aware that I use the word implication systematically to mean the conditional. I realize that implication is somewhat ambiguous between logical consequence and the conditional. So when I'm talking, I prefer to say the conditional to mean the object language logical operation. But in the slides, you systematically have implication for other reason, but that always means the conditional. So also the conditional, of course, presents his own paradoxes of material implication. We all know that the material conditional doesn't seem to be a good representation for the natural language if-then conditional. There are lots of examples one can give to argue the point, but there are also interesting arguments that actually are collapse arguments, try to argue that the given plausible assumptions, for example, disjunctive syllogism, try to argue that the natural language conditional collapses on the material conditional. So you can see it in effect as a paradox in itself. On the one hand, we have reason to think the natural language conditional is different from the material conditional. On the other hand, we have reasons to think the opposite. So it's really a paradox as well, and it's something where substructural logics have usefully been applied. So we keep in mind these three kinds of paradoxes, and now let's move already to introducing substructural logics. So logic so is a series of, it's a couple of definitions. A logic is structural if it includes all the structural principles that are valid in classical logic, otherwise we call it substructural. So that's what the substructural logic is, but of course raises the question, what is a structural principle? And for our purposes, I think the best elucidation of the notion is to say that principle is structural if and only if it doesn't concern particular object language expressions. That's a slightly vague definition. Let's try to make it clearer with an example. Take, for example, the principle of adjunction. You have there on the third point. That's the principle that if you have two premises, phi and psi, then you have the entailment to the conclusion of the conjunction, phi and psi. And that principle is not structural, right? Because it concerns a particular object language expression, in this particular case, the operator of conjunction. But there are lots of principles that are structural. So let me give you a kind of standard list of the most prominent structural principles that are valid in classical logic. So first of all, you have the entailment or reflexivity. That's structural because it doesn't, as you see, it just talks about any sentence whatsoever. It doesn't presuppose that the sentence contains any particular logical operators. So that's the only entailment that basically is structural. Then in classical logic, we also have a lot of principles that connect entailments with other entailments. So in the slides and in the talk, I'm going to call them, for this reason, meta-entailments. Often I also call meta-rules or meta-inferences. I prefer to say meta-entailments. So very, very briefly, also because in this audience, these principles are already all familiar, We have the principle of monotonicity, label K, and the labels, all the labels for these principles basically come from the traditional combinatory logics. So monotonicity basically tells you that if you have a valid entailment, you still have a valid entailment if you add further premises or further conclusions. Then you have a kind of generalized version of the principle of transitivity that's in sequence calculus systems that's usually known as the cut principle. Then you have a principle of meta-entailment of contraction that basically tells you that if you have a valid entailment with a premise or the conclusion taken twice, then you can kind of contract the premise or conclusion into a single occurrence of that formula and still have a valid entailment. And then we also have the meta-entailment of commutativity that basically says that the order of the premises or conclusion doesn't matter for the validity of the entailment. So these are the, as far as I'm aware, these are the main structural principles that people usually discuss in logic and philosophy. For our, I mean, they're all very interesting. For our purposes, as you see during the talk, I'm going to focus mainly on the principles of monotonicity and contraction and a little bit less on transitivity, because these are actually the most salient principles that become debatable once one looks at the paradoxes we've mentioned. Okay. So there are these paradoxes. One way of approaching the paradox is not by revising the extra logical principles, the kind of naive principles, but is to revise the logic itself. So instead of using classical logic, use a non-classical logic. And of course, one option among non-classical logics would be to go for a substructural logics. And in fact, there are especially I think in the last, more or less in the last 20 years, there have been a lot of development in this direction, people trying to apply certain substructural logics to solve one or other of the paradoxes we've mentioned. So for example, you have a lot of non-contractive or non-transitive solutions to the semantic paradoxes. You have the same kinds of solutions also for the paradoxes of vagueness, and you have also quite a few solutions that they use a non-monotonic logic for the paradoxes of the material conditional. So it's been a very fertile, productive line of investigation in the last 20 years or so, and it's these substructural approaches to paradox have proved to be really interesting, among other things, because they, even their opponents, recognize that they have certain important advantages over structural, non-classical solutions to the same paradoxes. So, because this is kind of an important point, I like to spend a bit of time explaining what the main advantages of substructural approaches to paradox are. So you have a first advantage that basically consists in the fact that once you can kind of nicely separate the structural level from the operational one. So in a substructural logic, you can yes, revise some of the structural principles, for example, deny, I don't know, the principle of contraction, but then you can leave the principle for the logical operations, for negation, for the conditional, for conjunction, and so you can leave them just as they are in classical logics. So in particular, of course, some principles, some derived principles are going to fail because these principles rely on the structural principles, but at least the fundamental principles governing the logical operations can be preserved. So just to give you an example of this general fact, consider the principles for negation. So these are the fundamental principles for negation, at least the one way of looking at negation, are the law of excluded middle and the law of non-contradiction. And in fact, when you look at non-classical solutions to, for example, to the semantic paradoxes. The structural ones, which are the traditional solutions, they usually solve, for example, the liar paradox by either denying the law of excluded middle, the so-called paracomplete approaches, or by denying the law of non-contradiction, so-called paraconsistent approaches. Whereas if you look, for example, non-contractive or non-transitive solution to the semantic paradox, is an interesting feature of them is that they allow you to preserve these fundamental principles of negation. They allow you to preserve both the law of excluded middle and the law of non-contradiction. Now, you might ask me, well, why is it interesting or important to preserve the law of excluded middle and the law of non-contradiction? And of course, one can debate about that, but I think that there is at least one important reason for why it would be desirable to at least be able to have a notion of negation that obeys both principles. And it's because if you think about that, it seems that a notion of negation that, for example, really excludes what it denies, so that it's really incompatible with what it denies, that seems a totally intelligible and theoretically important notion. The same with a notion of negation that basically covers every possible way in which a sentence fails to hold, not just when the sentence is clearly false, but also when the sentence is indeterminate or in some other way defective. There's a notion of negation that covers that. Just every case where a sentence fails to hold, there's a weak notion of negation that applies to all such cases. And that's, of course, that's a notion of negation that satisfies the law of excluded middle. And again, it's a notion that is both intelligible and is theoretically important. And in fact, you can combine these two features. Have a notion of negation that simply means that the sentence that is being denied fails to hold in some way or other, either by being clearly false or by being indeterminate or defective or whatever. And just that. And that notion, which again, I repeat, is intelligible, is theoretically important. In fact, you can even catch proponents of non-classical approaches, structural non-classical approaches using this notion of failing to hold in some way or other. That notion requires contemporary satisfaction of the law of excluded middle and the law of non-contradiction. So it's if you look at things this way, it's really important to be able in your non-classical system to have an operation that obeys both excluded middle and non-contradiction. But usually standard non-classical approaches cannot do it. They either have to deny excluded middle or non-contradiction. So it's a big advantage of a substructural approach that allows you to preserve both these principles for the same operation. So that's the first advantage. Second advantage that's been even more prominent in the contemporary discussion is the fact that the substructural approaches allow you to have a nicely unified solution to all the paradoxes that seem to belong to the same kind or to the same family. Now, take as example, again, the semantic paradoxes. So I mentioned the liar paradox. If you look at traditional non-classical solutions to the liar paradox, these usually, as I already said, these usually either deny the law of excluded middle or deny the law of non-contradiction. So they solve the paradox by basically revising the logical behavior of negation. And that there might be, I already mentioned why that's a problem in one sense, but in other respects, they might be fine. The problem, a further problem comes when we keep in mind that there are semantic paradoxes that seem to belong to exactly the same family as the liar paradox, where negation is not an issue. And here the paradigmatic example is given by Carry's paradox. It's a kind of, you all know it is a paradox where we only use the conditional as logical operation, and we still manage to derive. In fact, it's even worse than the liar paradox, because in the case of paradox, we can derive an arbitrary conclusion. So if your solution to the liar paradox was to simply revise the behavior of negation by, for example, denying the principle, the law of excluded middle, then once you're faced with a Carry's paradox, if you want to solve it, you have to do something totally new concerning the behavior of the conditional. Now you not only have to revise the logic of negation, but now independently of that, you need to revise the logic of the conditional, and the revision you made about negation doesn't give you any guidance about how to revise the logic of the conditional. In the case of the conditional, you need to either deny modus ponens, in the case for Carry's paradox, or conditional proof, and there's no indication from failure of excluded middle or non-contradiction with respect to which of the two, modus ponens and conditional proof, should fail for the conditional. The two issues seem to be completely independent of one another. So in fact, when you look at structural non-classical solutions to Carry's paradox, they do solve the paradox by revising the logical behavior of the conditional, but that's a solution that is totally independent from the solution that's been given to the liar paradox. Well, in the latter case, the revision was about negation. So it's not a unified solution to the liar and Carry's paradox together. There's one solution concerning negation for the liar paradox and another solution concerning the conditional for Carry's paradox. So that's theoretically, that's very unsatisfactory, because it seems that the root of the paradox, both in the case of the liar and in the case of Carry's paradox, is the same. So it should be, intellectually, it'd be much nicer if we had a single solution that takes care both of the liar paradox and Carry's paradox. And substructural approaches can do that, because although the liar paradox mainly uses negation as a logical operation and Carry's paradox uses the conditional, when you analyze the reasoning, you can see that both in the case of the liar paradox and in the case of Carry's paradox, there is a step of contraction, and also there's a step of transitivity, for example. So if you you can have a unified solution to the liar and Carry's paradox, for example, if you deny the principle of contraction, because that's a principle, it's actually crucial in both derivations. And in fact, you can show that quite generally, you can give a systematic unified solution to the semantic paradoxes by, for example, denying the principle of contraction, or by, for example, denying the principle of transitivity. So you can have a unified solution, whereas if you had a structural non-classical approach, you cannot give such a solution. All right. And then vaguely related to this, there's a third and last advantage that I want to mention, and this concerns the fact that we can have paradoxes that use naive notions governed by naive principles, but where, contrary to, for example, the liar paradox, no logical operation is being used. And this is, to give you an example of this, again, has been very much discussed in the last 10 years or so. You can have paradoxes of naive validity. So instead of using the semantic notion of truth, you can use a semantic notion of validity. Consider a self-referential sentence that says basically that the argument from itself as a premise to an arbitrary conclusion is valid, and that's going to generate, together with some plausible naive principles of validity, that's going to generate basically a validity analog of Carry's paradox. And the interesting thing about this new paradox of validity is that when you look at it, there's no mention of logical operations. There's no use of negation. There's no use of the conditional, and so on. So you cannot possibly solve this paradox by keeping the naive principles for validity and revising principles for logical operation, because there's simply no principle of logical operations being used in the paradox. But again, if you analyze in detail the reasoning, you're going to see that the reasoning, even in this case, involves applications of some structural principles, again, in particular in the case of paradox of validity that's used both of contraction and of transitivity. So again, if you can give a unified solution also to this new kind of paradox if you adopt at least one of these two kinds of substructural logics. So this is all I wanted to say about important theoretical advantages of substructural approaches to paradox. And I repeat, these have been discussed in the last 20 years or so, and it's even people that in the end prefer a different kind of approach agree that at least prima facie these are important advantages of substructural approaches to paradox. So I'm going to skip the fourth point on this slide and move on to presenting the problem for this talk. So as already mentioned in introducing the topic of this talk, there's a common view about the relation between the structural level, I repeat, the level of structural elements like premise combination, entailment, and conclusion combination, and the operational level, the level of the specific logical operations like negation, conjunction, disjunction, and so on. And the common view is that the structural level is more fundamental, is prior to the operational level. Well, this means that the structural level is constituted and behaves the way it does independently of the operational level, and actually that the behavior of the structural level at least partly determines the behavior of the logical operations of the operational level. And once you have this common view about, as it were, the structure, the hierarchy of a logic, the hierarchy between structural level and operational level, and this kind of view is quite clear from the beginning of logical investigation on substructural logics. It's quite clear. Costa-Dogen has been one of the main promoters of investigation into substructural logic, and you can see quite clearly in Dosen's works this idea that is really the fundamental level is really the structural level, and that's what determines then the behavior of the logical operations. So once you have this common view about substructural logics in themselves, then it's also tempting to kind of speculate that then approaches to paradox, they use one of these substructural logics have the advantages I've just mentioned, and you might even think are successful, exactly because they use a logic that revises classical logic in a more fundamental level than standard structural non-classical logics do. Because substructural logics, by operating on the structural level, would be operating at a deeper level in the logic than a standard structural non-classical logic. So you might think of it as well that substructural approaches are more successful because by working at the structural level, as it were, they deal with the paradox at its root, rather than at the more superficial, symptomatic level of the logical operations. And this view about why substructural approaches are so effective, it's also quite common in the literature. For example, I mentioned here in the slide a paper by Dave Ripley, who is one of the main proponents of the substructural approaches to the semantic paradoxes and paradoxes of vagueness, where it very clearly and nicely presents this explanation of why substructural approaches are so successful. So, for example, this was a bit abstract. Let's take, for the rest of the talk, I'm going to take to make ideas more concrete. I'm going to take as example the particular relationship between the structural element of premise combination and the operation of conjunction. So that the common view applied to this case would be that the level of the structural level of premise combination is more fundamental and prior to the logical operation of conjunction, again in the sense that premise combination is constituted independently of conjunction and partly determines the logical behavior of conjunction. So that's the common view applied to the particular case of the relationship between premise combination on the one hand and conjunction on the other hand. So that's the, as I said, that's the common view. What I'd like to do in the rest of this talk is to present and argue in favor for what I think is a better view, which is in fact totally the opposite of the common view. So in general, I like to argue there is the operational level that is prior to the structural level, and I will argue in favor of this thesis concretely by taking the example again of conjunction and premise combination. I like to argue now that conjunction is prior to premise combination, and in fact, I like the argument I give support an even stronger conclusion, namely that premise combination consists in a certain kind of conjunction. So that's the, I'm going to give you a series of arguments for this claim shortly. Before giving you the arguments, I'd like to make a crucial clarification about the thesis I want to defend. The thesis is about a non-linguistic, logical, mathematical operation of conjunction. It's not about a linguistic symbol for conjunction, which I call the operator of conjunction. So that could be the wedge or the ampersand or whatever you can introduce in the language of a logic to express the idea of conjunction. So when I say the conjunction is prior to premise combination, I don't mean to be talking about a linguistic symbol, because obviously you can have a logic where that allows for combination of multiple premise, but doesn't have in the language doesn't have a symbol for conjunction, doesn't have an operator for conjunction. But even in that case, I think at least typically, given what the logic overall is as a system, given its semantics, its model theory, its proof theory, or whatever, even if the language of the logic itself, at least in certain presentation, doesn't have a linguistic symbol for conjunction, given the semantics, proof theory, and so on, you can see that the logic does have a non-linguistic logical mathematical operation or conjunction that is where is lurking in the system, even if, again, this non-linguistic operation need not be expressed by any particular symbol in the language, might not even be definable by other symbols in the language if the language, the particular presentation of the logic uses a particularly expressively poor language. So it's very important that the claim is about this non-linguistic mathematical operation of conjunction rather than about the linguistic symbol that might express conjunction. Okay, so that's the thesis formulated and clarified. Now let me give you the arguments in favor of the thesis. I basically have one main master argument for this, which is very simple and natural, and then I also have three supportive arguments. So let me start with the most important argument, which I call here on the slide the master argument. So it's really what I consider to be the main argument in favor of the thesis. As you see, it's an extremely simple argument. So if you consider a premise combination, for example, simply two premises, phi and psi, then usually when we think about a logic from a purely technical point of view, we might think that these are simply combined together in a set, or in the case of certain substructural logics, in a more fine-grained collection, like a multiset or a sequence or what have you. But anyway, the combination is simply the fact that these two premises belong to a certain set, or anyways to a certain class-like collective entity. But that's clearly, once you think about the natural philosophical interpretation of an entailment with the two premises phi and psi, that clearly doesn't capture the force of premise combination. when we think about an entailment from phi as a premise and psi as a premise to a conclusion, the entailment is representing hypothetically the fact that phi and psi not only belong to the same set, but is representing the phi and psi hold together, hypothetically. And it says, if phi and psi hold together, then you get certain consequences, which are the conclusion. That's the standard, I would say, canonical understanding of what an entailment from premises to conclusion represents. So it represents something, when it represents the premises combined together, it represents something much stronger than simply the fact that the premises belong to the same set or the same sequence. It represents the two premises hypothetically as holding together. The question is then how we combine these two premises so that the representation has the force or representing them as holding together. Simply set combination or sequence combination, as I've already explained, that is too weak. So what is the right way of combining them so that hypothetically we represent them as holding together? And of course, the natural thought at this point is that the phi and psi holds together simply means the phi holds and the psi holds. So we combine the holding of phi and the holding of psi by means of a conjunction. But then if that's how we what the force of holding together boils down to, of course we are representing premise combination as being a certain kind of conjunction. The conjunction that conjoins phi is holding with psi holding. Now, there's an issue there about what is exactly conjoined, whether it's simply phi with psi or whether it's something more metalinguistic, as I myself have been talking about it, so that we say it's phi's holding with psi's holding, or phi's truth with psi's truth. And for most of the talk, I like to stay neutral about this choice. You might develop a version of this view where what's conjoined is simply phi with psi, or you might have a more metalinguistic version of the view where what's conjoined is the fact that phi is true with the fact that psi is true. For most of what I'm going to say, one can have either version of this view. The point of this master argument is to argue that the force of premise combination is achieved via conjunction. So that's my main argument. Now, I also I think the important auxiliary arguments that strengthen the case I'm trying to make for my claim. So let me briefly go through these auxiliary arguments. I basically have three of them. So the first, in the first auxiliary arguments, I think it's easier to introduce it by shifting momentarily from the case of premise combination to the case of conclusion combination, because there is, when you first introduce to someone the idea of multiple conclusions, the question immediately arises. What does it mean to have multiple conclusions? What does it mean that certain premises entails, for example, the combined conclusions phi and psi? How to understand the combination of these two conclusions? And I think if you think about it, so abstractly put, the question is ill posed, right? It could be there are equally legitimate different ways of understanding how to combine conclusions together. For example, usually in logic and philosophy, we consider multiple conclusions combined together as holding alternatively. So that we say that conclusions phi and psi means that phi holds alternatively with psi. So if phi doesn't hold, then psi holds, and vice versa. But it's equally legitimate, and for some purposes, it might be even more useful to have a system of multiple conclusions where the multiple conclusions are understood as holding together, just like premises are usually understood. So that if we have multiple conclusions phi and psi, that represents the phi and psi hold together rather than alternatively. Both of these ways of understanding conclusion combination are in principle possible. So some might be more useful for some purposes. The other one might be more useful for other purposes, but they seem both theoretically legitimate. And God knows there might be even further ways of understanding the combination of conclusions. So we have these different possible ways of combining conclusions, and then we have the question how to understand them. And then, of course, the obvious explanation of them is to explain that, for example, when they hold alternatively, that means that either phi holds or psi holds. So that basically it's a mode of combination that is disjunction-like. Whereas the second kind of combinational conclusion would be naturally explained by saying that on that mode of combination, phi and psi means that phi holds and psi holds. So that the combination now would be conjunction-like. So what really grounds these different modes of combination is simply whether we use a disjunction or a conjunction in combining the idea the phi holds and the idea the psi holds. And once you see this point about conclusion combination, I think it's clear that exactly the same point applies to the case of premise combination. Now, this is also, I don't want to lay too much weight on this further consideration, but this point is also clear when we think about how we introduce students in the first place to the idea of multiple conclusions and multiple premises. I think it's most of us, if not all of us, when they have to first introduce the idea, they will say exactly to the students, look, when you have multiple premises, you must think of them as being put together as in a big conjunction. Whereas when you have multiple conclusions, you must think of them as being put together in a big disjunction. I think that's the explanation that is extremely common in the teaching of logic, and it's also extremely natural. It's something that we would naturally say. And this extreme commonality, the spontaneity of the explanation, I think is good evidence. That's not only a kind of external pedagogical device that we're using to introduce something that is totally different, but actually this explanation is objectively on the right track, is correctly tracking the fact that these modes of combinations are basically consist in a certain kind of conjunction and in a certain kind of disjunction. All right, so that's the first auxiliary argument. Now, second auxiliary argument is takes its lead from the fact that in most, even in classical logic, but also in most substructural logics of interest, we have a very striking fact if you think about that coming from our perspective. We have the fact that premise combination, for example, is totally intersubstitutable with conjunction, in the sense that if you have a valid entailment with phi and psi combined together as premises, then you also have a valid entailment where these two premises are replaced by the corresponding conjunction. We have this kind of full intersubstitutability fact. And if you think about that, there would be, if premise combination were independent of conjunction and conjunction independent of premise combination, so if they were independently constituted one from another, there would be a miracle. How could it be that two notions that are independently constituted actually perfectly match one another in the way formulated by full intersubstitutability? Whereas it's not a mystery at all, for example, if you adopt the thesis I'm proposing, if premise combination just is a certain kind of conjunction, then that's just what you expect. Then you can fully substitute premise combination for conjunction and vice versa, because premise combination itself is a conjunction. So there would be a very natural explanation of the intersubstitutability fact. But if you don't want to accept my thesis, then either you leave it as a mystery or as a miraculous coincidence, or you must explain it in some other way. Now, of course, there is an alternative explanation, which also, interestingly enough, is not. I don't think it's a chance. The Ripley himself, together with J.C. Bill, has proposed in a paper, and the idea is exactly the opposite: is to say we have this full intersubstitutability because conjunction simply has the purpose of expressing in the object language the idea of premise combination. But I think that's a very unlikely thesis to maintain. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on that. Let me just focus on what on the last point on this slide. So my second, so that's the one that starts with secondly. It's very hard to maintain that conjunction simply expresses premise combination because, as I already mentioned, it's kind of plausible that premise combination is a metalinguistic affair. It's something that concerns, for example, if you have a snow is white and grass is green as premises, premise combination concerns the two sentences, snow is white and grass is green. So, for example, it represents them as holding together. But when you move to the conjunction, snow is white and grass is green, that's not metalinguistic at all. That's an object linguistic statement that is simply about snow, is simply about grass, and is simply about the colors. It's not at all about linguistic entities of the sort the sentence snow is white and the sentence grass is green. So I think I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I think that the opposite thesis, the conjunction simply expresses premise combination in the object language, is a confusion of meta language with object language. That is not at all plausible. So I think the only good explanation we have for the full intersubstitutability fact is if we adopt the thesis I'm proposing, that premise combination just is a certain kind of metalinguistic conjunction. All right. So let me give you a third and final auxiliary argument. This at least takes off from a more technical fact, and it's the fact that most substructural logics of interest enjoy a very natural and elegant model theory, particularly in algebraic semantics. But once you look at how the logical consequence is defined for a substructural logic in this kind of in the algebraic semantics, there's something very interesting from a philosophical point of view happens, because an entailment from a sequence of premises to a sequence or conclusion is defined as valid, just in case if you take the conditional that has as antecedent the conjunction of the premises in that order, and as conclusion the disjunction of the conclusion in that order takes designated or top value in every model. So in the algebraic semantics, really it's super clear that all the single structural elements are being reduced to the logical operations. It's totally clear that the premise combination is reduced and interpreted as a conjunction, that entailment is reduced and interpreted as a conditional, and the conclusion combination is reduced to and interpreted as a disjunction. So it might be that the semantics are totally instrumental and they're not at all illuminating about the real workings of the logic. But that's, given how nice the semantics are, that's actually an unlikely view. It's much, for those of us that would like to take the semantics in a non-instrumental fashion, to think that they really shed light on the objective structure of the logic, this kind of semantics provides a very strong argument in favor of the idea that for the substructural logics at least, premise combination consists in a certain kind of conjunction, and similarly for the other structural elements of entailment and conclusion combination. All right. So these were my arguments for the claim. Now, as I said, I mainly argue, taking as example the relationship between premise combination and conjunction, but as was very clear in the last auxiliary arguments, but also in some of the previous arguments, I think it's in principle you can work it out for yourself for all the arguments I've been giving. Analogous arguments can be given also for the relationship between the other interesting pairs. So we can give an analogous argument for the relationship between conclusion, combination, and disjunction, and analogous arguments for the relationship between logical consequence or entailment on the one hand and the conditional on the other hand. But I'm not going to try to work out the details, at least during the talk. But I think it should be pretty clear that the argument generalizes to these other relationships. Now, this is concerning how general the argument is. Then I should also, in the other direction, qualify the target of the argument by saying that, of course, the argument only works when the implicit assumptions I'm making in these arguments are satisfied. And while these assumptions are satisfied, as far as I can tell, for basically every substructural logics that has been used in the last 20 years to try to solve some of the philosophical paradoxes I've mentioned, of course, there can be other substructural logics that don't satisfy some of the assumptions of my arguments. So I don't want to make a super universal claim about every substructural logics. I simply want to make a claim about those substructural logics that have effectively been used in substructural approaches to paradox. All right. So now I'm going to move to the last part of a talk, and I'm going to assume now that the arguments I've given in the previous part are successful, so that effectively and quite generally, the operational level is prior to the structural level. Once we assume this, then space opens up for reinterpreting from a philosophical point of view what's happening in classical and substructural logics concerning the failure of structural principles. So, for example, if you take the principle of monotonicity, label K, now we can explain, for example, why this principle holds in classical logic but doesn't hold in non-monotonic logics in terms of the behavior of conjunction. We can say that monotonicity holds in classical logic but not in non-monotonic logics, because conjunction in classical logics has the property that the conjunction phi and psi entails each conjunct phi and conjunct psi, but in non-monotonic logics, conjunction doesn't have this property, also called a principle of simplification, that fails in non-monotonic logics, and that's why at the structural level, then we have failure of monotonicity, because at the operational level, we have failure of conjunction to have this property. Now move on, skip the part about transitivity, move on the last point about contraction, label W. Similarly, we can explain why the structural principle of contraction is valid in classical logic but not valid in non-contractive logics by saying that that's because fundamentally at the level of conjunction, in classical logics we have the entailment from a sentence phi to the conjunction phi and phi. So it's kind of the self-conjunction, if you want, of the sentence. Whereas in non-contractive logics, what fundamentally happens is that this entailment fails, conjunction doesn't have this property, and that explains why then at the structural level we have failure of the structural principle of contraction. So we have this kind of reversal of the explanation for why structural principles fail in substructural logics, now in terms of the conjunction, for example, failing to have certain classical properties. And if we accept this this explanation, that really leads to a reconceptualization of what substructural logics fundamentally do. What they fundamentally do is not to deny structural principles, is rather to deny certain operational principles, the conjunction, disjunction, or the conditional having classical logic, and they determine that classical logic has the structural principles it has. So on this reconceptualization, substructural logics are much less different in kind from traditional structural non-classical logics than it's commonly assumed. Both types of logic, what they fundamentally do is to revise the behavior of certain logical operations. The difference, if you want, between substructural logics and kind of standard non-classical logics used in philosophy is on which kind of operation, which operations they focus on. Substructural logics focus on conjunction, disjunction, and to a lesser extent, the conditional, whereas traditional structural non-classical logics of philosophical interest typically focus on negation. In fact, I like to argue that substructural logics, as used in substructural approaches, typically don't even focus on the conditional. They really focus on only on conjunction and disjunction. And this is an important difference, because if we can set aside the conditional, then conjunction and disjunction share a very interesting property that the conditional doesn't have. And that's the property that both argument places of conjunction and disjunction are upwards monotonic. So that means that you can, if you substitute in these argument places a formula that is logically weaker, then the resulting compound formula is also logically weaker, and vice versa, and the same for logically stronger. Whereas that's of course not the case for the conditional, because the argument place in the antecedent of the conditional is not upwards monotonic. In fact, is the opposite. It's downwards monotonic if you substitute a logically weak antecedent, that you get a logically stronger conditional. So it's quite clear that, for example, non-monotonic and non-contractive logic simply focus on conjunction and disjunction under the reconceptualization I propose. You might think that's less clear for non-transitive logic, that transitivity seems to be more about the conditional itself, but actually I don't want to spend much time on this. I think that for many non-transitive logics used for example, for solving the Sorites paradox, one can diagnose what's happening in this logic as basically not being about the conditional, but them also being about conjunction and disjunction. That's not true for every philosophically interesting non-transitive logic, but I think at least for those that, for example, I myself have proposed for solving the Sorites paradox, an argument can be made that they fundamentally also focus on conjunction and disjunction. If you want, I can talk more about this in discussion, but during the talk, I'm going to leave it at that. So if I'm right about this, then not all substructural logics that have been applied to the philosophical paradoxes, but the vast majority of them really focus simply on revising conjunction, the logical behavior of conjunction and disjunction. And as I said, this is an interesting natural kind, because these are operations that are upwards monotonic in both arguments places. So here on the slides, I also call them, for this reason, operations of positive composition, in the sense that they don't involve any negative element in them. So once we move, and now I'm going to close the talk by moving to how this reconceptualization reflects on the interpretation of what's going on in substructural approaches to paradox. Because if an approach to a paradox diagnoses the problem of the paradox in the use of classical logic, whereas we should have used a substructural logics. And if a substructural logic now under the reconceptualization I'm proposing, what fundamentally does is to revise the classical behavior of conjunction or disjunction, then a substructural approach to a paradox is basically diagnosing the problem, the root of the paradox, as consisting in an anomalous behavior of conjunction or disjunction, anomalous behavior in general or positive composition. And this diagnosis might initially strike you as far-fetched. No? If you think about the first paradox we started with, the liar paradox, it doesn't seem like the problem, the fundamental problem with the liar paradox has to do with conjunction. It doesn't seem that whatever mistake we make in the paradox, it's surprising to be told that that's a mistake that we make when operating explicitly or implicitly with conjunction. It seems that the issue is about negation or something else. So this diagnosis that follows under the reconceptualization I'm proposing might initially strike you as not very plausible. But when you think back about the advantages of substructural logics, if you think about it, these are all preserved even under the reconceptualization of substructural logics that I'm proposing. So if these advantages are good evidence for the idea that a substructural approach is on the right track for solving the paradoxes, this becomes good evidence for thinking that the diagnosis that the approach is giving is correct. And so in this case, the diagnosis is really that what goes wrong in one of these paradoxes is what we are doing when operating with a notional conjunction or with a notion of disjunction. So actually, we have good evidence that perhaps initial appearances, notwithstanding the root of the paradox, at least in the case of self-reference, in the case of vagueness, in the case of even of the material conditional, the root of the paradox is really something we're doing wrong when we're reasoning with conjunction or with disjunction. And I think that's at least an interesting new way of looking at these paradoxes. So I thank you very much for your attention. Again, I close here the presentation. I'll give you simply some very short list of references of some of the issues I've touched on in the presentation. Thank you very much.